When I'm on the trail of a poem, it seems to exist in the space just out here in the air outside of my head.
When I'm writing the piece, if the word and the expression or the phrase are going to come out in Spanish, I honor that.
I'm writing the whole thing on Facebook.
Hola, I am Mariano Zaro and I am a poet. In the early 90s, I moved from Spain to Southern California and I encountered a thriving poetry community. Now, as the host of Poetry.LA Interview Series, I had the privilege of talking to many of these poets. How do they write their poems? As you're about to see, they have given me a lot of answers.
It doesn't come in one big creative rush. It comes in a series of little pieces. It'll be sometimes you're driving or you're stuck in traffic or you're not stuck in traffic or something, and a line comes into your head and you go, where does this line belong and what does it mean? And you sort of set it aside, and then later you find that there's a kind of thread and it connects to a poem.
There are often like days where I'll drive and I'll write a poem while I'm driving, like in my head. I'm playing with words and how it sounds and, you know, all of that kind of stuff as I'm driving or when I'm cleaning up in the house, and then I'll hear pieces and then I'll later record them.
I walk with a poem, I take showers with a poem, and then there is a moment in which it's like, this is a poem, let me write it.
I always carry a notebook with me. I still do, not used to, but presently. And when I would stop at a stoplight or anytime I had to wait, I hated to have my time wasted standing in line at the bank, at the post office, getting ready to pay for my groceries. I have that notebook out, making notes for poems. If a line would come to me, you know, sometimes I'd pull over if I'm driving. I pull over to the curb and I write the line down and then I go on my way.
It's sort of inescapable. I mean, it's part of my writing life and my writing practice that I always have a correspondence. I'm always writing, generally to people, as opposed to, I don't do very much journaling. I don't do a diary. No, instead, I carry on correspondence with my friends who are distant, and I like postcards.
My actual writing process is one that's really scattershot. You know, I might write a poem about your coat and then a poem about a glass of water, and they don't have anything to do with each other. And that's how I tend to write. But I also know that it's really difficult to publish a book that doesn't have some sort of cohesion to it. So my most recent chapbook is called Occupations. And I looked up the occupations for a bunch of really strange or unusual occupations, like honey processor, rose cutter, you know, all these jobs that actually have specific duties. And I went off into kind of fantasia about each of those.
I'm particularly aware of patterns that I have. Right now, with this particular poem, it seems to me that I'm on a kick where I feel like I can't use any conjunctions, and it seems to me that this is a poem that wants to come out at a certain time of day, and I'm only working on it at a certain time. I'm thinking about it all day, but to work on it in the morning would feel wrong. It needs to be night when I'm less rational.
There's have to be something emotional at stake, something so strong in me that is forcing me to sit down to write this down, so I had to have that going. Second, I had to have some kind of form. And that form would change depending on the subject. Sometimes the experience itself dictates the structure of the poem. And the third thing is the poem has to be about more than one thing. There has to be more than one thing happening in the poem. You know, it can't just be about a dead pig. It has to be about a dead pig, and it has to also be about the slaughter of a generation.
I write a lot in between books. For example, my limited edition books are almost always poems that I wrote after I'd finished one book that would be like a Harper Collins book, or in the old days, Houghton Mifflin books.
but I didn't know where I was going next. And I'd start trying things. I'd start writing different kinds of things. And sometimes they would work out, and sometimes they wouldn't. And it would take me maybe a year, 2 years before I found something that was different for me, that I found something that I felt I hadn't done before.
So one of the things that matters to me that I think is a kind of touchstone for me is the idea of impact. In order to create that impact, and by that I can mean one or I can mean several things. I can mean a poem that sort of grows on you and then coalesces at the end in some final sort of culmination that pulls together all the different little elements of the poem and then sort of explodes in implication and meaning. And I use the word implication because sometimes you cannot pin down the meaning, but there's implications.
The art is not just in writing ideas and feelings and images. It's assembling everything in such a way that when you get to the end, the whole thing works. Mm-hmm. And my other analogy for that is you begin with a piece of shattered glass. All the ideas, all the images, all the feelings are like the shattered glass. And then when you get to that last line, the windshield becomes clear. That's my image of a poem.
From the earliest age, I would stand beside the lathe as he was working at, and it built in me this instinctual admiration for craft, for making things. And so for me, making poems is not that far away from making parts for oil rigs or whatever it is.
I think of it almost like a picture album or something, like this poem looks like this, or this feeling looks like this. I almost am not sure exactly what will go in the poem until I can understand what the form will look like.
Oddly, the form comes with the writing. When I sit down to write, there are short lines or there are long lines. I love both. I've been working on short prose pieces lately. Autobiographical pieces that have some elements of story. I'm not interested in conventional short stories, but I'm interested in what we tell each other as story. What gets us about story, because it's such a human instinct to want to hear story and tell story.
I consider myself essentially a storyteller who's chosen the genre of poetry to tell my stories. But a lot of what I write when I'm writing these family stories are really for my nieces and nephews, my great nieces and nephews, so that when my brothers and I are gone, they'll have these kernels of stories so they know where they came from.
I like that sort of border between the autobiographical and the mythical, and how we can fit a lot of the mythical characters from literature and the Bible, and in our own culture too, in pop culture also.
I mostly talk about myself and use other people as players.
I see.
I don't always write the truth, but there's truth in everything I write. Individual incidents in the poem may be changed or telescoped or, but I write from my own experience.
I've definitely learned, as a poet to know why I'm doing this. I'm writing first and foremost for myself, to work through the things that I'm thinking and feeling in a way that hopefully translates to my reader. And because I'm writing for myself, at the end of the day, regardless of what the reception is, I feel okay with that.
I'm the first audience member. So the moment I stop thinking about my poetry as being a kind of epiphanic, I'm going to find a hidden truth and I'm going to share it with all of you and you are going to receive it. The moment I start thinking of myself as the first person trying to ask a question, the first person to recognize that sometimes the question doesn't get answered, then I feel like I'm writing something that's more useful for me as a writer, and perhaps to a reader as a part of this larger project of presenting differences and being okay.
I tend to be one of these people that wear their hearts on their sleeve and are kind of just honest. And that carries into my poetry. So even if I'm not explicitly saying something, I think the people involved who I'm referring to, they know who I'm talking about. So it gets me into some trouble.
A poet that really is clear, it's like he's standing naked in front of the audience. When I write my poems, I am really trying to speak to the audience, just like I'm talking to you. I'm saying, I've lucked into, blundered into something that I think is amazing. And I want you to understand it. I want to share this with you. When I succeed in doing that, I think the poems work. And I think that if all poets really thought in that way, it might be better. I think a lot of them just think nobody's going to read this anyway. And who I'm really writing for is the editor of American Poetry Review or something that I want to get in.
I want to be heard. Otherwise, I wouldn't publish my work. You know, I can be a writer and not publish. So I publish because I want to be heard. I write in a multi-layered way because I want to be understood by everyone at every level. I want a teenager to read my work and understand what he or she can get from it. And then from various other readings, get to deeper levels.
Poetry even means to shape, to make. And so it's like, okay, so what am I doing? I need to remake my life with poetry.
Yeah.
I need to say more than I'm just stuck here. I think this is how I help with even healing with people, because they don't got the poetry in their life. I go, even if you want to be a poet, get poetry in your life. Use language. Make the images help you find the door to get through. Yeah. And it actually is a healing. This is where poetry and language can be healing. Mm-hmm. And that's how I try to use it in my life, but then I try to help others do the same thing.
It's about making meaning out of this life that we have. And so many people, go through the day and don't really focus on that. And I think just engaging the world and thinking about your own life in a deep way and what the meaning of it is, it's really a spiritual kind of thing for me, in a secular way.
Poetry is meant to feed your spirit, not your body. If you're very lucky, you will be a poet with a job. It might be a job teaching poetry. It might be better for your poetry if it's a job as a plumber. You'll probably make more money and own a house.
You can look into the eyes of somebody 20 years old and you use the word talent. You have talent. And they'll go home, divorce the spouse, sell the house and move to Paris. It has magical effects on people. What I think you need is not this mysterious thing called talent. I think you need a really deep love of the art form, where you love poetry so much, you just have to make it yourself. And a capacity for really hard work.
Until I discovered poetry, I didn't think I would ever be able to express my life. And so the poetry became this thing of, wow, I have all these things inside me that I want to say now. And it gave me access to people. It gave me access to love and experience and sharing and community that I never imagined I would have. So it's pretty like I think I modeled my entire life and lifestyle around poetry at this point.
The act of writing the poem, for me, is a very sacred moment. You feel like it's a moment where you're getting in touch with a certain force that has been here before you, that was given to you when you were a child, but somehow between your early ages as a child and your adulthood, you had somehow lost it somewhere. And every time I try to sit down and write, I'm trying to get in touch with that force.
I feel like that's what people want from poetry now, is
something that helps them spiritually or emotionally. The mystery, I think, is really something that we all like and we all want. Everything is very explained, and everything is we can know everything just about. And the more we know, the less we know in some sense about love and death and things like that. And so I think those are what we are looking to poetry for now, at least I am.
You know, I'm very attracted to the ordinary and how that can be mythologized or made into something grand, because I think that exists, you know, and some great poetry does that too, even in mythologizing our very intimate experiences.
What is different as I've matured is poetry that is gentler, hopefully wiser, more attention to nature.
When I was younger, I definitely, wrote very in a bubble, in my own little world. I didn't take poetry classes. I wasn't part of a poetry community. And it was very much just my own exercise of therapy, of, using poetry to express my feelings. As I've gotten older and, in the last 6 or 7 years, I've been much more part of a poetry community, learning a lot more poetry, hopefully improving my craft. What might be the same is that it's me still. I'm a little bit, a little bit dramatic, a little bit, it's still a little bit angsty, I guess. There's still a little bit, always an edge of sadness to my poems. It's still a way for me to exercise my troubles.
I'm a sentimental poet. There's no question about that. I try to avoid, as the predictable.
Yeah.
I try to, look for the fresh. And over the years, I think I know what my voice is. And so I just try to make it better.
I have always been working to make visible and redeem the feminine soul. My mother died when I was 16, and I have always felt that generally the feminine soul in our culture is sorely missing.
As a feminist, I believe in collaboration. I think that there is something almost patriarchal about the idea of the artist.
The author.
The author,
Yes.
right. And even though that's mostly what I do and how I spend my time, this idea that that you share with somebody is a wonderful idea.
What I've been doing a lot with the music, collaboration with Robbie, who I've been working with, is that he'll just start composing something. He plays a lot the piano. So he'll compose something or have a musical idea. And at the same time, I'll just start writing in the notebook and, just start writing what images are evoked from what he's playing.
Music.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what the songs are coming from. And it's really been so fun. It's really exciting.
I get some very, very, like a fringe of an idea, like the brush of a feather or something. But it has a little tiny bit of possibility or energy there. And then I think maybe that would work. And then sometimes I just write down a lot of words that are words that have to do with, like, that words that seem to like enrich the possibilities. Sometimes I go to a thesaurus and just like wander around looking for words that seem connected. And sometimes I don't. And then sometimes I start writing and I take the computer and I close it so I don't look at what I'm doing. So it's just like I can put my hands there, but I don't see it. And that makes me like a little calmer and makes me feel like maybe there's a chance I could write something, because if I'm looking at it, oftentimes I'm criticizing it as I go.
If I have a poem that I see a kernel of something that's worth following, don't give up on it. At some point you may have to abandon it, but just keep pushing until you get as far as you can.
I'm moved by something. It sort of turns around in there. It starts like, sort of like Velcro starts picking up lint. And
that's a great image.
No. And then it picks up lint, and then I realize that the lint means something, and I start picking the lint out of the Velcro and putting it down on the page. Okay. I mean, if I can use a weird metaphor. But it gathers itself, and I don't know where it's going. Sometimes when I wrote a poem in Spanish for my mother, it came intact while I was in the garden. It just, I was my own amanuensis, you know, I was just taking dictation to what was coming in. And occasionally poems have come like that. But usually it comes from that sort of meditative place that you observed, because I'm listening to something that's coming very far away. And sometimes I can't hear what it's about. As it gets closer, I sort of hear what it's about. And then I might be editing something else, and a phrase or something from the thing I'm working on professionally for someone else in a job, that a phrase will jump up or a word will come up, and I will go to the dictionary to look up that word, and something there next to it will trigger the thing I'm thinking about.
For me, there's something about having a framework already, and sometimes a very weird, kind of absurd framework that helps me enter into it and get into some, you know, actual what I'm really thinking or wanting to say. But it's been a while where I'm just like, if I just have a blank paper with nothing, I'm like, I don't know what to do. Yeah. But you give me a character who's doing something, and now I'm able to make that doing something be a thing.
The poems are very elliptical. A lot of them, I sometimes will produce a narrative type poem, not that often. And then I wait to see. So it does demand this sort of trusting, which is the deepest pleasure of it, I think. The trusting that something will come when that qualitative feeling is there, when what would be called the Shakti is there. It's just you can feel something is occurring.
It just kind of happens, like something will just spark it, and then it happens really quickly. I don't, tend to do a lot of revising or anything. It just kind of comes and it's ready.
I usually start with a pen. I really need that because it's like the poem comes down the brain and out and right on the page. With a pen, usually, if I can find it, my fountain pen. And then I do like 2 or 3 versions that way, and then I put it on the computer. And I keep each version and number them because I do teach a lot of poetry classes, and I find the students find it very useful to see how my poems progress from the first version to sometimes usually the 9th or 10th version before the poem's finished. And I do that also for myself to see, that's how it started and look where it's gone now. And, and I find that a very useful process.
I like moving a poem through as many drafts as possible. I love revision. Because I go deeper and deeper.
I absolutely want to avoid syntactic ambiguity. And if I need to change a verb from this to, say, the present participle to avoid some parallelism and an ambiguous antecedent, right.
You will do it.
I will do that. No mercy.
The haiku is famous for focusing on specific physical description. And so that is always something that I kind of admired in writing, the specificity of that literature. And so it was definitely something that was influencing my writing. But I think it's been a kind of formative and important, maybe unexamined influence on West Coast literature, from Gary Snyder to Kenneth Rexroth to Copper Canyon Press with its Chinese logo.
Certainly, when I write it out the first time, I don't I don't hold back. I put everything out there.
Okay.
Editing is hugely important. When I edit, I take away sentimentality as much as possible. I pull back. I kind of learned that from Elizabeth Bishop, just from reading. But I don't want to be a sentimental poet.
I think you, as a writer and or poet, you have to be your own best editor in the end. Know where your line breaks are going to be. what kind of structure you want to do.
There used to be a commercial where they showed the slinky coming down the steps, so it was just, flow from one level to the other. And for me, that's kind of how poetry worked, where one word, where the enjambment is, kind of leads to the other thought, which may not necessarily be directly related, but introduce a different concept.
When I'm in the process of brainstorming a poem, I might have an anecdote. And so sometimes I do this self-consciously, sometimes I do it instinctively, is I will cluster an image or cluster a phrase. And I will begin to say something like airplane. And then I'll take airplane, I'll start going wings, nose, windows like eyes. So the airplane is a person with wings. The airplane is an angel. So now I have airplanes and I have angels. Okay. Airplanes dropping bombs closer to devils, the opposite of angels, and so on. And so I begin to start thinking laterally about the ways in which things connect.
One of the things that I really go for in my work is that place where the intellect and the imagination meet. I really am probably to my detriment fond of intellectual discourse. And I love the big Latinate words and the ideas and things, but they are not poetic unless they're accompanied by imagination.
So what I learned, at least, trying to write narrative poems, you have to somehow travel a line of movement between the vertical, the lyric, and the horizontal. And there are various ways that happens. I have one particular strategy that seems useful in some cases, not all cases. But other than that, it's something I really only know to do out of just the habit of doing it. But yeah, a narrative poem has to have not just horizontal movement, it has to have some kind of lyric depth, I think.
What I do think of when I'm writing my poetry is the musicality of it. I think like every poet, right? It's like paying attention to the rhythm, paying attention to the pace and the tone.
I personally don't think a poem is done for me until I read it out loud. No matter how great it may look on the page, the music of it is important.
So for me, music has always been a really crucial part of what I believe poetry is about. So poems don't convince by their arguments. Poems aren't essays. Poems persuade by their music. And it's the music of the poet's intelligence that actually persuades us. And if we experience the music of how a poet thinks through the language, then he or she has us, because then we're moving in the way their mind works. And so that's what I always keep trying to do.